Okay, well, welcome back to you in person and online for tonight's second lecture on Christianity and culture in early Ontario. This time, a time to gather stones together, transforming the architectural landscape to Toronto into the city of churches. Now, if you look at the first slide, it's the same one you saw at the end of last week's lecture. And I think it helps drive home the reality that Toronto, a relatively small community of about 30,000 people in 1851, was already incredibly diverse by that year and had been actually for some decades, at least in religious terms. This was the way that things stood at the end of what I call the missionary period of the city. Now, there is, of course, no hard and fast cutoff date to say that this is exactly when the missionary period ends and what is sometimes called the denominational period begins, but I think that the year 1850 is a reasonable date for several reasons which I'm going to explain. The first reason is because before 1850 in Toronto and surrounding regions, there was a certain religious fluidity in the area and the surrounding area, particularly among the Protestant laity. For example, if there wasn't a clergyman from your particular tradition handy, it wasn't at all unusual for Protestants at this time to avail themselves of the services of another denomination, since they shared so much in common at this point, namely a common Bible, the King James, a shared Reformed theological tradition, and, unhappily, a common mistrust of Roman Catholicism. It was a time when denominations were competing for the hearts and minds of these new settlers, and so you will find during this period Anglicans, for example, attending Methodist services on Sundays because an itinerant preacher happened to be nearby, but insisting on having a clergyman of their own tradition when it came time to perform marriages, baptize children, church women, and bury the dead according to the rites of the Book of Common Prayer. Moving on, before 1850, this fluidity was opposed by certainly certain members of the Anglican and the Presbyterian clergy. The ones that did oppose it emphasized that the rational order that God intended for society was indeed revealed through their church's laws, their prayer books, and their liturgical traditions. On the other hand, the Methodists, well, they were appealing more to the heart rather than to prayer books and laws and customs. The Methodists indeed maintained that a sterile, rule-oriented approach to faith, as you could find in books, well, that was never going to change society for the better. The Methodists insisted that you needed to have a personal experience, a personal relationship with God, leading to a personal conversion, perhaps begun at one of their camp meetings. And it was only by converting a wide swath of individuals that society itself could ever hope to operate in a moral and effective way. Anglicans and Presbyterians, however, rejected that idea. And they argued that society only improved when people acted with their minds, acted rationally, not emotionally, and that improvement was to be achieved through adherence to their respective prayer books, ordinances, laws, and traditions. So we have a tension that is building up in those years before 1850 between the Protestant communities. Looking at the next slide with John Strawn, he himself put it this way. He says, with regards to this whole problem, the pious Christian would be a loyal subject, and the loyal subject would be a pious Christian. And this loyalty to the state would be achieved, how? Through devotion to the Church of England. Now, this argument about what constituted true religion and how it was going to improve society, that was going to rage well into the middle of the 19th century in Toronto and the surrounding area. Moving on to the next slide. A second reason why I think 1850 is a good transitional date to go from the missionary period to the denominational period is because it's around that time that the Toronto Anglican Church saw an infusion of new priests coming into the diocese from England, graduates of the great English universities. Now, their passage to Toronto, as well as their positions here in the city, they were initially subsidized by the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, which was back in England. But the significant thing about this is that a fair number, probably even the majority of these newly arrived priests, were members of or had been influenced by the Oxford movement, which had begun in the 1840s and was starting to have an effect on the theological and political views of many Anglicans in England, but also here. Now, these new priests were taking over important parishes, such as Holy Trinity, down by the Eaton Centre. These priests, they were not interested in the idea of state support for the church, which Bishop Strawn, as I think we all are very well aware, was very interested in. These new priests rejected this because they had personally seen how politicians back in England had interfered in matters of the faith that they believed should have been left clearly to the church's religious authorities. These new priests did, at the same time, clearly espouse a very strong Anglican identity rooted firmly in the church's Catholic history and practice, and they viewed that the church they served was clearly distinct from the other Protestant groups that had been operating in and around Toronto up to this point. They would have strongly disagreed with Strawn that there were no theological differences, for example, between them and the Presbyterians. They opposed that fluidity that I said had marked religious life in Toronto in the previous decades, and they worked very hard to establish parish churches to ensure the continuing loyalty of Anglicans to their own tradition. And so in the decade of the 1850s, 24 new Anglican parishes were established in the Diocese of Toronto, helping to strengthen that unique Anglican identity. Now, not all Anglicans were thrilled about their influence, and that led eventually to the establishment of Wycliffe College as the training ground for Anglican clergy in and around Toronto who had more evangelical Protestant leanings, and that began in 1877. Moving to the next slide. I would argue that 1850 is also a transitional date because of what happened in the 1840s. In that decade, large numbers of Irish immigrants arrived in town, which we will talk about in greater detail next week. And as a result, the Roman Catholic community in Toronto also grew exponentially. As we saw last week, Catholic officials in town, well, they had collaborated with the colonial government, especially with regards to public education. But that changes after 1850. If you read the letters that were written by Catholic priests in that time period, you sense that they're experiencing something like a siege mentality, despite their very clear growth in the city. For example, one letter written by Toronto's Catholic bishop, Michael Power, written in 1846, asking for money from the Association for the Propagation of the Faith in Lyon, France, he gives a really clear sense of that Catholic siege mentality. He writes, "Here in Toronto, we find ourselves facing Anglicanism in all its strength and in all its vigor. Besides the Protestant cathedral that the Anglicans have, they have 3 more churches, university, and collegiate education is in their hands almost exclusively. Its adherents are numerous and they are rich. The Catholics, although numerous enough, are with very rare exceptions poor, or at least far from being well off. They arrive, especially from poor Ireland, and usually don't bring with them anything but the desire to work and to earn their living honestly." By 1850, as the Catholic numbers grew, the city had to deal with this new Catholic reality, which was not easy given the strained relations between Protestants and Catholics back in the old country. Moving to the next slide. When Bishop Power suddenly died in 1847, while he was caring for the Irish immigrants in the fever sheds that had been erected down by the lake, Catholic progress stalled until a new bishop, Armand François-Marie de Charbonnel, was appointed by Rome and took up residence in Toronto in that year, 1850. And from that point on, with the arrival of the Loretto sisters, the Sisters of St. Joseph, the Christian Brothers, and religious clergy like the Basilians and the Jesuits, the Catholic Church never again looked back in terms of its growth and influence as a denomination to be reckoned with here in Toronto. Moving on, the greatest challenge, however, that all of the churches faced just before and immediately after the year 1850 was the growth of secularism, combined with industrialization in Toronto. And this is going to have a direct effect on church architecture in the city, which is what I'm building up to. Now, it might surprise you that secularism is an issue at all in the 19th century, given the impression that we have about how very religious the Victorians were. We think of their churches filled to bursting, with people attending services 3 times on a Sunday, which many did in very large numbers. But moving on, the kind of secularism that Toronto experienced in the mid and the late 19th century, well, that was in fact a result of the great religious diversity that has been found in the city that I've been talking about. There was no official government policy of secularism in Upper Canada at that time, such as we can see today in Quebec, for example. There was, however, a general diminishing of influence over public policy by individual denominations in Toronto, since there was no single religious group that could speak for everyone. Because there was no state church, as you would have found it in England or Scotland. Now, this manifested itself in several ways. First of all, as you see in the next slide, through public education, the system that was reformed by Egerton Ryerson, which favored no single religion. With the introduction of standardized educational programming for professional teacher training, the role of clergymen, who had been, in fact, the main schoolmasters in the area from the beginning of the 19th century, generally starts to diminish until the clergy were all but eliminated from the classrooms. Moving on, Strawn's beloved King's College, which you'll recall he had established in 1827 as a strictly Anglican foundation in Toronto, through a certain amount of political subterfuge on his part, well, it was secularized by the government, becoming the University of Toronto in 1850, after a very bitter public battle which Strawn lost. Moving on, the Clergy Reserves, which we spoke about last week, those reserves that had originally supported the Anglican Church financially until the rebellion of 1837, when the Presbyterian Church claimed its fair share. Well, those reserves went on to the chopping block. Already in 1840, the government forbade the creation of any new clergy reserves. So the writing was on the wall that this connection between the church and the state was definitely coming to an end, and it finally did in 1854 in Upper Canada. After one final payout to the Anglicans and the Presbyterians in that year, with a nominal sum that they gave to the Wesleyan Methodists, the subsidization of churches in Upper Canada by the Crown came to an end. This transition from the missionary period to established denominational life came at a cost, because from this point on, as we are all now familiar with, it would be up to individual churches to support themselves solely from the donations of the faithful, supplemented at this period by appeals to the missionary societies that were back in the old country. Now, for the Catholics, this all made little difference, since they enjoyed no real government support financially anyway. For many in the Protestant churches, however, this leveling of the playing field was a shock. And it made some very important Toronto clergy and laity question the assumption that they had always had, that the Crown needed the church if it was going to ensure the loyalty of the people. So moving on, it was in response to this new situation that Strawn asks these series of questions. He asks, can religious liberty be preserved in no other way than by putting all religions on a level as equally entitled for support from public encouragement and protection? Are the Quran, the Vedas, the Book of the Mormons, and the Holy Bible to be held equally sacred? And are the public authorities, the organs by which the nation acts, to take any of these indifferently as the rule to direct them in their public proceedings? And in a nation of Protestants who have high and peculiar interests to preserve and transmit to posterity, are all places of power and trust, and even the throne itself, to be open equally to the atheist, the infidel, the pagan, the Mussulman, the Romanist, the Mormon, and the Protestant? Is the kingdom of Satan, in whatever shape it may appear, to enjoy the same public favor as the kingdom of God? Is a Christian church, a pagan temple, and a mosque to be equally held in honor? In one word, is the freedom of the city to be bestowed on all the gods of mankind? Well, it appeared that the answer to all these questions was effectively yes. And if we move on, if that weren't bad enough for the poor Protestants in the second half of the 19th century, that community, both in Toronto and around the world, was going to be shaken by the discoveries of Charles Darwin with regards to evolution, as well as the new methods of studying and analyzing the scriptures begun in Germany, which was now causing many to question the historical truth of the Bible as it had been certainly understood since the Reformation. So, if the Catholics had felt under siege in their own way, so now too did the Protestants, but for very different reasons. Secularization in Toronto from 1840 through to the end of the 19th century was a reality that the Protestant community in particular could not ignore, which oddly enough now brings us to the subject of church architecture in this city. On to the next slide. Bear in mind that church architecture is not just a matter of constructing buildings for the practical purposes of creating a worship space. There is meaning behind the design and construction, and these both reflect the scriptural, the theological, and the cultural principles, and it has really been like that since the 4th century when specifically Christian churches started to be built. Moving on, when we turn to the first permanent Protestant churches that were built in Toronto in the early part of the 19th century, sadly none of which survive, we will find that they were mostly, and certainly in the early period, all built in the style that is called the neoclassical. Now, this style had emerged in England and subsequently in the American colonies in the early part of the 18th century. And it's called neoclassical because it harkens back to the style that was used by the ancient Greeks and Romans for their public buildings. It emerges in England as a part of what is known as the English Enlightenment, a philosophical, scientific, and political movement that began at the end of the 17th century. Now, the English Enlightenment was in many, many ways a reaction against Puritan fundamentalism, the Puritan fundamentalism that had been at the very heart of the English Civil War. With the Puritans' narrow and very literal reading of the Bible, England had effectively turned into a rather unpleasant theocracy for more than a decade in the middle of the 17th century. The Enlightenment, which followed that time, it rejected this narrow and non-scientific approach to life and advocated for a shift of focus away from divine revelation as the sole guiding principle in society to using human reason instead. And among the ancient thinkers from which the Enlightenment drew inspiration was the great Roman architect Vitruvius, whose theories fueled a passion for neoclassical design. And both the state and the church in Britain, their architecture rapidly adopted his ancient style, communicating the message that the partnership between an enlightened church and an enlightened state was not only possible, but it was desirable. Neoclassical architecture is characterized by grandeur of scale, simplicity of geometric forms, Greek or Roman details, dramatic use of columns, and a preference for blank walls. Now, we're going to look now at a series of slides that give you an impression of what neoclassical architecture looked like. So slide 17 is Mansion House in London that was built in 1739. The British Museum, 1759, as I say, both in London. Moving to the next slide, you can see in Dublin, the General Post Office, the famous General Post Office, built in 1817, and the Bank of Ireland building, built almost a century before in 1739. Turning towards Edinburgh, in the next slide, you can see the City Chambers of Edinburgh that was built in 1753, and the Queen's Hall. These are but a few of the many, many neoclassical public buildings that British settlers would have had in mind when they immigrated to Toronto and began their own building projects, both civil and ecclesiastical. Looking at the next slide, you can see that a few of these neoclassical public buildings, at least, still do survive in Toronto, such as Osgoode Hall and the St. Lawrence Hall on King Street, across the street from the Cathedral. Now, early immigrants to Toronto, they would have had this, what then was very trendy new style in mind when they began their plans for church construction here in town. If you look at the next slide, you can see a few examples that they would have seen back in the old country of this neoclassical style. For example, St. Paul's, Covent Garden, which I'm sure you've all seen if you've been there sitting in Covent Garden. It's right there at the end of the square. Or if you've been up to Birmingham, to St. Paul's, which was built in 1777. These are just two of the many, many neoclassical churches that were built that exerted incredible influence on Toronto church architecture in the first half of the 19th century, so before 1850. Looking at the next slide, you can see here is without doubt the most influential architectural example of this neoclassical movement, and that is St. Martin's in the Fields, Trafalgar Square, which was constructed between 1722 and 1726. If you travel through New England, you will see reproductions of that church all over the territory. It combines the main features of neoclassical church architecture that we will find in those early Toronto Protestant churches as well, such as a fairly plain facade, generally of one unifying material, rounded arches rather than pointed windows, as we have here in St. Olaf's, the use of pillars and pilasters, and the presence of a triangular pediment over the front door or the porch. If you use your imagination and look at St. Martin's and picture it without any steeple, you're looking at a pagan temple that could be in Athens or Rome. The choice of neoclassical architecture for St. Martin's was not just a matter of chance or taste. If you look at the next slide, you can see that St. Martin's intentionally matched many, many of the new buildings that were associated with government power just down the street from it in Whitehall, as well as the residences of the royal family, all of which are still situated within the parish boundaries of St. Martin's. The choice of this new neoclassical style was sending an important message. It was linking the church firmly to the state, the new state. And at the same time, it is also rejecting the Gothic style, the Gothic architecture that you would find, for example, at Westminster Abbey or at St. Margaret's Church attached to it. And all of the associations that there are with Gothic culture, particularly medieval religious superstition. This neoclassical architecture, however, is also a rejection of the Baroque style that had been emerging in the late 17th century and typified, when you think about it best, by Rennes St. Paul's Cathedral. Because that cathedral, in the minds of many, had an overt association with Roman Catholic architecture, especially St. Peter's in Rome, when you compare them side by side. So what about here in Toronto? Well, by 1834, Toronto had already been called by its mayor. 1835 was already being called the City of Churches. And that's not so much because of the devotion of the people, but because of the large variety of denominations in town just simply required so many different church buildings. It is, to me, remarkable in a frontier town like Toronto just how many incredibly beautiful churches were erected at this time, and sadly, they are gone. If you look at the next slide, the magnificent, I think, St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church, which stood at the corner of Church and Adelaide Streets, just across the road from St. James. It was built in 1830, and the spire that you're looking at there was added 10 years later. The church, which you see there, was actually built of brick, and then it was stuccoed over and painted white, resulting in an austere, restrained, but classically beautiful appearance. Looking at the tower itself in the next slide, you can see the tower is pure neoclassicism, and it combines, in fact, the famous Tower of the Winds that had been erected in Athens in the year 50 BC with the monument of Lysicrates, which had also been erected in Athens in the year 335 BC. You wouldn't think that kind of thing was going on in colonial Toronto. Old St. Andrew's has been described by architectural scholars as precise, carefully designed, rational, and altogether satisfying, and it is an excellent example of neoclassicism with its arched rather than pointed windows and its use of pilasters. The next church we can look at is the Adelaide Street Methodist Church, which was constructed in 1832. Here, once again, you can see the use of arched rather than pointed windows, a plain facade composed of only one material, a simple triangular pediment at the top of the building, as well as triangular pediments over the three entrance doors, all combining to announce this restrained neoclassical style. If you move on to the next picture, a split within that congregation, within the congregation of Adelaide Street Methodist Church, the Methodists were always splitting, it seems, led to the foundation of a new church, the Wesleyan Methodist Chapel that stood on the south side of Richmond Street between Yonge and Bay. That building was constructed in 1844, a magnificent structure. It was effectively a basilica, like a Roman basilica, with Roman Doric columns across the front and an elevated parapet that hid the slope of the roof line behind it. The base of the triangular pediment was decorated with restrained geometrical designs. Rounded arched windows and doors reinforced the connection to that ancient Roman basilica style. And although it was in fact built in Toronto's traditional red brick, you can't tell that from looking at the picture, because it was actually painted white. The whole thing was painted white to give it this temple-like feeling as if you were in Greece or Rome. Sadly, it was no longer needed by the Methodists after the construction of Metropolitan Church, which is at the corner of Church and Queen today, and so that building you're looking at was demolished in 1888. Toronto has not done a good job at preserving its historical buildings. Moving on to the next early Toronto church, Zion Congregational Church. It was erected in 1840 at the corner of Bay and Adelaide Streets. Like St. Andrew's, it was a brick structure and it too was covered in white stucco. Zion is still considered the finest example in Upper Canada of a church that had been built in the Greek Doric style, with the main entrance between two freestanding Doric pillars. Pilasters framed the corners of the building with a Doric entablature encircling all around the top of the four walls. Sadly, the church burned in 1855, and a new sanctuary was erected on the same site in the following year, which we will see momentarily. Moving on then to St. James Church/Cathedral. The second structure that replaced the original simple wooden church, which we saw last week, it too was erected in the neoclassical style in 1833. But we have no pictures of it. It burned in 1839. After a very rapid reconstruction project, a second neoclassical building was reopened, which is the picture you can see here. That building was reopened in December of the same year, but now as a cathedral. Although it lacked the pillars that we generally associate with neoclassical architecture, it had all of the other expected features, including the pilasters between each of the windows that created this 6-bay appearance on its sides and a 3-bay appearance across the front. The main door, as you can see there, was surmounted by a classical triangular pediment, and all the windows, of course, had rounded arches rather than pointed. Unlike all of the other churches that we have encountered thus far, this older form of St. James was actually built of stone, not of brick, so it was meant to be permanent. Looking at the next slide, however, permanence was not something it was afforded, because this neoclassical cathedral was destroyed during one of the deadliest fires that Toronto ever experienced, which began on the morning of the 7th of April, 1849, at the corner of King and Jarvis, destroying 15 acres of the central business district. But as you can see, because it was built of stone, the walls themselves survived, and you get actually a really clear picture of the rounded windows, the architecture. But this meant then that it was necessary to construct a new cathedral. And that once again brings us back to the year 1850, which I've designated as the end of the missionary period. It also marks the beginning of many, many new church building projects in the city besides St. James Cathedral. Moving to the next slide. The difference, however, is going to be that in every single case, after 1850, that neoclassical style, it's going to be abandoned in favor of the Gothic. The Gothic revival is going to become the standard for Protestant churches in Toronto. So what are the features, the main features of this new, quote-unquote, Gothic architecture? Well, the principal features are pointed arches for windows and doors, interior rib-vaulted ceilings, and decorative items like porches, dormer windows, roof gables. You will also find that the roofs of these new churches were far more steeply pitched than you would ever have found in the neoclassical churches. Moving to the next slide, you can see that Gothic revival-style churches often feature castle-like towers and crenellated parapets, such as you can see in this picture of both Holy Trinity, Eaton Square, and Little Trinity on King Street. Or another important feature will be incredibly high spires, such as you find at St. James, which still to this day is the tallest spire in Canada. What you will not find in any of these churches are rounded arched windows, the use of pillars on the outside and pilasters, or triangular pediments. Now, before I explain why that's the case, let's just look at the shift in style, congregation by congregation. And the first one to start with is St. James Cathedral. And in this next picture, you can see side by side the old St. James Cathedral and the current building, which was completed in 1856 with the porches and the tower added to it in 1875. With its much, much higher elevation, its pointed windows, Its interior rib vaulting, there is no way you could ever confuse the new St. James as a classical structure. And it is indeed one of the finest examples of the Gothic to be found in Toronto, if not all of Canada. Looking at the next slide, as I mentioned just a few moments ago, Zion Congregational Church, like St. James Cathedral, also needed a new building after its sanctuary was burned in 1855. Its replacement, which you can see there, was a magnificent neo-Gothic edifice built on Adelaide Street, not far from the cathedral. The next slide, you can see St. Andrew's Presbyterian. The old church had become too small to accommodate its growing congregation, and so in 1876, the congregation moved west to a new site where it still stands at the corner of King and Simcoe. Now, the new St. Andrew's is not built in the Gothic style. It is built in the Scottish Romanesque style, which has similarities to the neoclassical, but is medieval. And that's an important thing to bear in mind. It is a nod to earlier medieval architectural traditions in Britain. And despite it having arched windows, that is in fact a part of the medieval Romanesque tradition. But its other features clearly set it apart from the neoclassical. As for the Methodists, they too were on the move, not only physically around the city, but also again splitting within their respective congregations. And so in the next slide, you can see that by the 1860s, the congregation that had worshipped at Richmond Street Methodist Church, well, they also needed a larger space, and the result was the magnificent Metropolitan Methodist Church, which came to be known as the Methodist Cathedral and was built in the new neo-Gothic style, opened in 1872 at the corner of Queen and Church Streets. But moving to one last ecclesiastical rebuild that I want you to see, because I think it helps explain to us the reason for the transition in Toronto from those neoclassical churches to Gothic churches, better than anything else, and that is Bishop Strawn's King's College. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it was with a bit of subterfuge that Strawn had persuaded the British government to establish Toronto's first university as a strictly Anglican institution in 1827. But on the 31st of December of 1849, the government of Upper Canada secularized it. It was no longer going to be a religious institution, much to Strawn's consternation and dismay. So between the fire that had destroyed his cathedral and now the secularization of his university, 1849 had proven to be a very bad year for Strawn and for the Anglican establishment here in Toronto. And so what was his response? His response was to establish a new Anglican university called Trinity, which you can see at the bottom, originally built in the neo-Gothic style in 1851 in the Bellwoods neighborhood on Queen Street, and thereby hangs the tale. Because you see, this decision to change styles in Protestant architecture, church architecture in Toronto after the year 1850 is not just a matter of shifting tastes, although that is part of the story. It is more importantly about the shift in the relationship between the Protestant churches and the state in the colony and in Toronto, now going to be symbolically expressed through new church architecture. The Anglican and the Presbyterian churches especially had seen themselves for centuries as state churches, but that official status had clearly waned in the second quarter of the 19th century and came to a real end, as I mentioned, once the Clergy Reserves were secularized in 1854. The writing had been on the wall for a long time before that, however. The dissenting churches, like the Methodists and the Congregationalists, well, they didn't have the same issues as the Anglicans and the Presbyterians with regards to the state because they'd never been state-supported. But they had their own issues. And their architectural decisions to embrace the neo-Gothic, they were a reaction against the growing secularization and industrialization in Toronto society. The classical architecture that they had all been using to this point when they were building their original churches and the original government buildings here in town, had been reflective of a mutual support between Protestant church and state at that time. But this was no longer a reality in the city after 1850. And so the choice to shift to the neo-Gothic style was an intentional one. And it was part of a general romanticism for the Middle Ages that we also find in Victorian painting and literature. Moving on to the next slide, it was more than just a shift in taste, as I've said. By the mid-19th century, the Middle Ages, oddly enough, were being reclaimed by Protestant church designers as the expression par excellence of the last great age of faith, when the church was still at the very heart of society. Victorian Protestants were wistfully looking back to the Middle Ages, wishing to reclaim that era when religion was the force to be reckoned with. By the 1850s, Anglo society was shifting dramatically away from piety and faith and reliance on the scriptures to the use of human reason, to industry, to science. The greatest English advocate for this new Gothic style was Augustus Pugin. You know him best as the architect of the new British Houses of Parliament. And the reason he chose the Gothic style, he was very clear about it, because he said, in this style, we find the faith of Christianity embodied and its practices illustrated. Symbolically, these new Gothic churches that were popping up all around Toronto were meant to visually reinforce the idea of the sacred in an increasingly secular city. You didn't want your churches anymore to look like the town hall or the legislature or the courts or the markets. You wanted people to walk down the streets and look at these new churches and recall perhaps the medieval church in which they had grown up back in their hometowns, and the faith, more importantly, that had been at the heart of village life. And so as a result, the second half of the 19th century saw only Gothic Protestant churches built in Toronto. As one scholar puts it, all these new Gothic churches with which we are now so familiar, buildings like St. Olaf's, changed the appearance of a frontier town from what had been simple classical lines to the Gothic everywhere. It was impossible to determine the denomination of the church simply by looking at the architecture, since they were all variations on a theme. Some contemporary observers describe them beautifully, I think, as sermons in stone. At least that was the case for the Protestant churches. But what about the Roman Catholic community? Well, there were only 2 Catholic churches built in Toronto before 1850. If you look at the next slide, you can see the first, which is St. Paul's, which was built in the Parliament and Queen Street area where the Irish Catholic community had been settling. As you can see from this photograph, this church that was erected in 1822, it was the antithesis of the neoclassical style. Everything about it is Gothic in character. The windows are all pointed rather than rounded. There is no attempt to use pillars or pilasters to create separate bays on the building. The building materials are mixed, brick and wood, and there is no effort to cover it over to make the building look like it was made of a single material, as we had with the neoclassical Protestant churches that had been using stucco or paint to achieve that effect. An extended front porch adds to the complexity of Old St. Paul's, which was clearly inspired by the medieval churches of Ireland. The important thing was that should you have walked past that building in 1822, you would have immediately known it was not Protestant, and that was the point. Moving on to the next slide, the other important Catholic church construction project from the first half of the 19th century was, of course, St. Michael's Cathedral, which also rejected the neoclassical style in favor of the English neo-Gothic, about a decade before that style really caught on in the Protestant community. Construction on St. Michael's began in 1845, and the building opened for public worship in 1848. As a nod to Toronto's earlier history as the town of York, fragments from a stone pillar and from the old roof of York Minster Cathedral are actually sealed into St. Michael's cornerstone. And if you look at the next slide, as you enter into the main doors of St. Michael's this day, the heads of Edwin, King of Northumbria, and of St. Paulinus, the Archbishop of York, are the very first things to greet you. It's as though the architect is saying, don't let the Protestants fool you. York's cathedral over there and this new one here are both Catholic. In a real sense, by rejecting the neoclassical style favored by the Protestants, Toronto Catholic architects in the first half of the 19th century were being intentionally countercultural, making it very clear to anyone walking past these two buildings that they were not like most of the other churches in town. Distinguishing Catholic houses of worship from Protestant ones was of paramount importance at this point. So then what happens to the Catholic churches once Protestants start building in the same medieval style that they have been doing? Well, as you see from the next slide, the transformation of Old St. Paul's Catholic Church, the Protestants and Catholics basically just switched directions. As the Protestant churches embraced the Gothic, Catholic architecture starts moving towards a variant of the neoclassical style, known as the Renaissance or Romanesque revival. These churches are easily identified by their pronounced round arches, rather than pointed, and heavy, massive stone or brick construction. Most of these churches have towers and squat columns and decorative plaques inlaid with intricate patterns. Now, since this style is really an imitation of Renaissance architecture, which was, of course, borrowing from the ancient classical era, you will also find domes are occasionally added to these churches. And so if you look at the next picture, by the 1870s, St. Paul's Catholic Church in Corktown, well, it was becoming just far too small for the burgeoning Irish Catholic population. And so in 1889, this new church, with a seating capacity of 1,250 people, was opened, built in the Romanesque revival style. And to look at it, especially to look at its interior, you would be forgiven if you thought it was sitting on the Via Veneto in Rome rather than on Queen Street down in Corktown. But that was exactly the point. Through this architecture and through this decoration, the Catholic Archbishop of Toronto at the time, John Joseph Lynch, was effectively saying, whenever you look at this building, think of Rome. You see, by the time the Catholic bishops, by this time, the late 1870s, 1880s, the Catholic bishops in Canada had become what is called ultramontanes. And what does that mean? Well, ultramontanism was a movement that had emerged after the French Revolution that emphasized the centrality of Rome and of the papacy within the worldwide church. It really became dominant, however, after the definition of papal infallibility at the First Vatican Council in 1870. And so if you look at the next picture, here you can see Our Lady of Lourdes Church on Sherbourne Street, which had been established as a parish in 1879, with its neo-Romanesque building opening in 1886. Again, this structure would be far more at home in Rome than in waspy Toronto, but that was the point. It was in fact modeled on the Church of Santa Maria del Popolo in the very heart of Rome. And other Catholic churches and religious houses would follow suit. We'll look at them just quickly. The next one, the magnificent, truly magnificent Loreto Abbey that had been constructed for the Sisters of Loreto on Wellington Street at Spadina in 1897, sadly destroyed in 1961. It would follow in the same style. Looking to the next picture, St. Clare's Church in the West End, in the Earls Court neighborhood, not too far from here. Looking at the next picture, in the East End, Holy Name, which is in Greektown on the Danforth near Pape. And then if you look at the next, St. Anne's on Gerrard Street near Broadview, and there were others. St. Patrick's on McCall Street, St. Lawrence out in Scarborough. It's not to say that Catholic churches during this period wouldn't be constructed in the Gothic style, because some were, but it is clear that the Catholic Church was going an extra step in many cases to ensure that there would be no confusion about which buildings belonged to Rome and which belonged elsewhere. So what I'm hoping is that you can see that by now, as Toronto transformed into the city of churches, the architecture of our various houses of worship represented a lot more than just aesthetic choices. Statements were being made in stone and in brick about those who built these churches and about those who worshiped in them, and we are still living with that legacy today. By 1893, if you can picture this, there were 90 church buildings that had been built in the small area bounded by Front Street, River Street, Bloor, and Bathurst. 90 churches in that space. 25 of those church buildings seated more than 1,000 people. 5 of the Methodist churches alone in that area seated more than 1,500 people, which gives us some sense of what church attendance was like in those days. John Ross Robertson's description in 1904 of Toronto's Sunday evening streets, while a bit romanticized, captures something of that church participation despite the increasing secularization and industrialization of the city. And he writes, "The feathery flakes of snow came thickly down like some white-winged messengers from a purer world than this, as the streets of the city were thronged with people eagerly hurrying towards the brilliantly lighted churches. The chiming of the bells made the air musical as their tones rang loud and clear and sweet. No other city on the American continent presents such a spectacle as is seen every Sunday evening on the streets of Toronto. Thousands of people walking the avenues and thoroughfares on their way to church." If you look at the next slide, it's a lovely picture that Robertson presents for us, but it's not entirely accurate. We know that a decline in church attendance was already happening by the end of the late 19th century in Toronto. Industrialization, with the building of factories, was forcing families, especially the new middle class, to move out of the heart of the city where these factories were being built into the suburbs, and they were leaving behind them only the poorest of the poor, causing one Methodist official to complain, "It is in vain that we are erecting handsome buildings and conducting decorous services if we do not reach the unchurched masses." The First World War and its aftermath would again change church attendance radically in Toronto. And many of those underused grand churches would be destroyed to make way for factories and commercial buildings and garages as the city changed. Other church buildings would be reimagined for commercial or cultural purposes, so some things have not changed. Much of Toronto's landscape, however, still retains the witnesses to this time of burgeoning growth in church construction. And if you are interested in learning more about Toronto's lost Anglican heritage, I can't recommend enough the website that you can see in the next slide, Lost Anglican Churches. It's a fascinating study of some of those wonderful Gothic and other sanctuaries that are now gone that helped make Toronto the city of churches. Of course, the main purpose of all of these buildings was to provide spaces for worship according to the many traditions represented in Toronto, and there were many. But they were so much more than that as well. They were also centers for community life and hubs for charitable activities and for social welfare, as we will discover next week in the final lecture. Since, as the Presbyterian theologian Timothy Keller says, the church is a hospital for sinners more than it is a museum for saints. Thanks very much.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Entertain a couple of questions. Yes, sir.
Yeah, good evening. First, speak again, 2 questions. The first one, the St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church, which corner of church in Adelaide is it?
No, it was on the it was on the northwest corner, if I'm picturing it right, northwest corner of Adelaide and Church.
And
There's I think a apartment building or something there now. I think. Not sure.
yeah, I like both cathedrals. Is St. Mike's Cathedral spire, is it the second tallest one in Canada?
That I don't know.
Oh,
That I don't know. I have no idea what the second one is, but St. James still remains the tallest, I'm told.
Anybody else? Questions? Looks
I've covered it all.
You did. Very thorough. Well, thank you.
Thank
This
you.
is wonderful.
Thank you for joining us.
Very much learned so much, and I think I speak for all of us, so thank you.
Do check out that website. There's a really interesting history in there for Anglican churches, for sure.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Take care.